Look at the entirety of human history, and you are staring at one glaring, seemingly unfixable architectural failure in how we govern ourselves.
Right, because we have completely historically divorced absolute power from absolute reason.
Exactly. I mean, if you map it out from ancient god kings claiming, the sun mandated their rule, to feudal lords, all the way up to modern, untouchable corporate tech monopoly.
Oh, absolutely, operating those black box algorithms.
Yeah, the entity holding ultimate power almost never feels structural pressure to give a coherent reason for its actions.
Right.
They hold the power, they issue the mandate, and they just extract obedience.
Usually through force or economic coercion or violence.
Yeah.
They do not explain the why.
They don't have to. The power itself becomes its own self-contained justification.
Which creates a system where compliance is, well, it's indistinguishable from subjugation.
Yeah.
And this is the exact sociological crisis Allama Parwez is diagnosing when he unpacks the first few verses of Surah Az-Zumar.
Right, and we should clarify for this deep dive that he does not read this text as a collection of theological comforts or, mystical poetry.
No, not at all. He reads it as a highly sophisticated structural critique of human governance. Parwez points out that the Quran introduces a radically different structural model for society.
By deliberately pairing two concepts that, in human history, are almost mutually exclusive, right?
Exactly. Al-Aziz, which translates to absolute power or authority, and Al-Hakim, which represents absolute wisdom or reason.
I want to stop right there and map that out, because in human systems, those two things sit on opposite sides of a massive canyon.
They really do.
I mean, the person or the institution with all the power, the military general, the absolute monarch, the central bank, they usually lack the overarching wisdom to foresee the long-term societal damage of their mandates.
And on the flip side, the philosopher, the academic, or the ethicist who possesses all the wisdom, they have absolutely zero structural power to enforce it.
Yeah, they can write brilliant essays all day, but they cannot stop a war or mandate a living wage.
Right. So Parwez is arguing that in a perfectly ordered society, the governing constitution must fuse these two elements. It must be Al-Aziz, meaning it possesses the sheer structural teeth to be fully enforceable.
No exceptions.
No exceptions. But it must simultaneously be Al-Hakim, entirely rational, empirical, providing the core reasoning behind every single mandate it issues.
And Parwez anchors that fusion in a profound sociological distinction between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom, doesn't he?
He does. Because, think about it, animals are governed by instinct and immediate force. They respond to the stick, the physical barrier, the immediate command of the environment.
But human beings are structurally different.
Yes, our defining characteristic is our intellect. We require a reason to comply. Parwez argues that if you force a human being to execute a mandate without providing the rational why, you are essentially bypassing their intellect.
You're treating them like a draft animal.
Exactly. Therefore, any legal system or government that operates on the premise of, do this because I possess the authority to make you do it, that is fundamentally degrading to human dignity.
So a true system for humanity must satisfy the intellect first.
Right. When a human understands and agrees with the empirical reason behind a law, their compliance transforms. It is no longer blind obedience to a master.
It's an active, rational agreement with a principle.
Precisely.
But, I struggle to see how any human-designed system actually achieves that in practice. Even in our modern democracies, which we consider the pinnacle of rational governance, the laws are ultimately a reflection of whoever lobbied the hardest.
Oh, for sure. Or whoever had the most capital.
Right, or whoever manipulated the voting bloc most effectively. Human beings are inherently driven by self-interest, class bias, and, a desire to protect their own wealth.
Which is undeniable.
If you put 10 humans in a room to draft a perfectly rational constitution, they will inevitably write a document that secretly benefits those 10 people.
They can't help it.
So if human leaders simply cannot engineer this balance of power and reason without polluting it with self-interest, what is Parwez's actual mechanism to solve this?
Well, Parwez asserts that the solution cannot come from within the human intellect, precisely because of the biases you just mentioned.
Okay, so where does it come from?
This is where he introduces his interpretation of tanzil, a term usually translated as revelation. But Parwez aggressively strips away the supernatural mystical aura that traditionally surrounds that word.
So no burning bushes or mystical trances?
No, he does not frame tanzil as a subjective, emotional inspiration bubbling up from the subconscious of a mystic. If the governing law originates from within the human mind, It is automatically tainted by the limitations, the era, and the class interests of that human mind.
That makes sense.
Instead, he defines Tanzel strictly as an objective external framework.
It's like playing a high-stakes board game where the person currently hoarding all the money also happens to have the power to rewrite the rules midway through the game.
That's a great way to put it.
As long as the players are writing the rules will always bend to protect the player who is winning. Parwez is arguing you need a rule book delivered by a completely outside party who isn't playing the game.
Right. Someone who doesn't care, who is wealthy, and who has no vested interest in the outcome.
Exactly.
That is a highly accurate parallel. Parwez relies on the Quran's own recurring analogy to explain this objectivity, which is the phenomena of rain falling on the earth.
Okay, how does that work?
When rain falls from the atmosphere, the soil it lands on has absolutely zero influence over the molecular composition of that water. The earth does not negotiate with the rain.
Oh, wow.
The rain is entirely objective, external, and unchangeable. Now, the soil below might be highly fertile, or it might be completely barren rock. The human society receiving this law might be advanced or primitive.
But the water itself, the foundational constitution, is an external reality untouched by human self-interest.
Totally immune to elite manipulation and entirely independent of any politician's agenda.
You know, think about your own workplace right now, or your local city council. How often do the zoning laws, the promotion metrics, or the budget allocations feel entirely arbitrary?
Very often.
They almost always reflect who has the most leverage, who commands the biggest budget, or who has the loudest microphone, not what makes the most logical, rational sense for the collective whole.
And Parwez is building a case that as long as human beings are the primary inventors of the foundational absolute laws of a society, those laws will eventually, inevitably bend to favor the architects.
The only escape velocity from that trap is a constitution that no human being, no matter their status, has the authority to alter or amend.
And that leads to the critical question of how you identify this objective law. Parwez focuses heavily on the concept of al-haq, which is conventionally translated as the truth.
But we're not talking some abstract philosophical truth here, right?
No, in his socio-economic framing, truth is not a philosophical abstraction. It is not a solipsistic argument you debate in a university lounge.
So what is it?
Al-haq is a concrete, established, structural reality. It is a system that proves its validity by manifesting tangible, constructive results in the physical world.
So it's empirical.
Highly empirical. If a law is al-haq, it means that when a society applies it, it produces measurable justice, economic stability, and human flourishing.
And if it doesn't?
If a law produces poverty, severe class division, and systemic oppression, it is empirically false, regardless of how many philosophers defend it.
Which brings up a massive structural problem, I think. If you have this perfectly objective, concrete truth, this unchangeable rain from the sky, how do you actually apply it to youth in history, which is constantly shifting?
But that's the big question.
You can't just run a 21st century digital economy on the exact same administrative bylaws used by nomadic tribes 1,000 years ago.
No, you definitely can't.
I look at this like the architecture of a skyscraper. You have the foundational steel beams, gravity, load-bearing physics, which are absolute and unchangeable. You cannot negotiate with gravity.
Exactly.
But the interior walls, the wiring, the purpose of the rooms, those have to be knocked down and redesigned as the needs of the occupants change. If you make the interior layout as unchangeable as the steel foundation, the building becomes useless.
That's a perfect analogy. And Parwez actually uses an analogy used by the early Arabs to explain exactly this mechanism, the analogy of the door.
The door. Okay, let's unpack that.
A functional socio-economic system requires two distinct components to operate. First, it requires hinges that are permanently, immutably fixed to the wall.
Right, because if the hinges are loose or if they slide around depending on who is in power, the entire door collapses.
Exactly. Those fixed hinges represent the permanent boundaries of the objective constitution. These are the universal principles that can never be compromised under any circumstance.
What kind of principles?
Principles like the absolute prohibition of economic exploitation, the structural guarantee of basic human needs, and the mandate for equal justice under the law.
But, I mean, hinges alone don't serve a purpose unless they are attached to something that moves. If you just take those fixed hinges and nail a piece of wood completely shut over the doorway, you don't have a functional structure, you just have a wall.
Right, the system becomes a prison.
The door itself must be able to swing wide open to let new ideas in, or close tightly to protect the society, adapting entirely to whatever the specific historical moment requires.
And that synthesis, The fixed hinge and the swinging door is the genius of the model. The swinging door represents human legislation.
So like the day-to-day laws.
Yes, the adaptable bylaws, the tax codes, the administrative policies that human beings create through mutual consultation to apply the permanent principles to their specific era.
Because the way you guarantee that basic needs are met in an agrarian society looks vastly different from how you guarantee it in an era of artificial intelligence and automation.
Exactly. The door swings wildly to accommodate the new era, to innovate, to adapt. But the door only functions safely because it is permanently anchored to the fixed hinges of the objective law.
I have a hard time buying that human societies can naturally maintain that tension, to be honest. If you look at our historical track record, we fail at exactly this balance point.
We really do.
We seem biologically wired to swing into extremes. We either become terrified of the future, paralyze ourselves with tradition, and nail the door completely shut, demanding that we live exactly as people did centuries ago.
Or the exact opposite.
Right. We decide the past is completely useless, we rip the hinges right out of the wall, and we swing the door into total relativistic chaos where absolutely nothing is permanent and all morality is subjective.
It's a very dangerous oscillation.
So what is Parwez's actual structural safeguard to prevent a society from collapsing into rigid stagnation on one side or destructive anarchy on the other?
Parwez addresses that vulnerability by pointing upward. He analyzes verses 5 and 6 of Surah Az-Zumar, which transition entirely away from human law and describe the physical laws governing the universe.
Oh, interesting.
He argues that human society must consciously mimic the cosmic blueprint. Consider the physical laws governing the planet. They are terrifyingly strict and completely unnegotiable.
Yeah, the Earth rotates on its axis at a precise, unvarying speed.
Right. And the text describes the wrapping of the night around the day, a relentless, unbreakable astronomical cycle. It details the atmosphere acting as a permanent protective shield, burning up meteors before they can obliterate the surface.
These macrocosmic laws are absolute. The universe doesn't take a day off. It doesn't hold a vote on whether gravity should be suspended for the weekend.
No, it doesn't.
The macrostructure is entirely tyrannical in its permanence.
But look at the result of that massive, inflexible permanence. Does it create a dead, static, frozen universe?
No, not at all.
Exactly. Precisely because those foundational laws are permanently fixed, they create a safe, stable container that allows for endless, dynamic, hyper-complex change.
Oh, wow. I see where he's going with this.
Because the planetary orbit is rigidly fixed, we experience the dynamic changing of the seasons. Because the atmospheric shield is permanently inflexible, incredibly fragile, ever-evolving biological life can flourish and mutate on the surface.
So Parwez is arguing this is the exact mathematical equation required for human society.
Yes, you must have fixed, unchangeable constitutional boundaries, the hinges, the atmospheric shield, to establish a secure container.
And once that container is locked in, society is free to evolve, innovate, and dynamically rewrite its legislation without destroying itself.
Right.
Because change without permanence is just an explosion, it's destruction. But permanence without change is rigor mortis. It's death.
Exactly. The cosmic model proves that true, vibrant life only happens when extreme permanence protects extreme adaptability.
The absolute laws aren't there to restrict human freedom. They are the atmospheric shield that makes human freedom possible.
They are designed to burn up the meteors of tyranny, monopoly, and exploitation before they can hit the ground and destroy the marginalized.
And that leads us to the meteors themselves. I mean, if this perfect balance of objective law and adaptable legislation is the architecture of a thriving society, why does human history look like a continuous crime scene?
Well, Parwez transitions from outlining the ideal structure to aggressively diagnosing the disease that rots our current structures. He launches a brutal critique of a sociological concept called wasila.
And this is where his analysis feels incredibly modern to me.
It really does.
Wasila is usually translated as an intermediary, a means of approach, or someone who intercedes on your behalf. But Parwez doesn't critique this on some abstract theological ground.
No, he critiques it purely as an economic and political mechanism of extraction.
He looks at priesthoods, spiritual guides, what are known as peers, in his regional context, bureaucrats, and absolute rulers, and he identifies them all as operators of the exact same grift.
He identifies them as societal toll booths.
Toll booths, that is such a vivid image.
Yeah, it is. These intermediaries actively manufacture a psychological distance between the average person and the ultimate authority or the objective law.
They convince the masses that the foundational truth is far too complex, too esoteric, or too elevated for a normal human intellect to comprehend.
Right, they paint the ultimate authority as a distant, easily angered emperor
Yeah.
who cannot be approached directly.
Right. They set up a bottleneck. They tell the public, you are fundamentally unworthy or fundamentally incapable of understanding the Constitution. Therefore, you must go through me.
Exactly.
Think about how this functions in the modern world. You see it in massive bureaucratic systems where you need a specialized lawyer just to understand your basic rights.
Oh, all the time.
You see it in lobbying firms that act as the only viable bridge between a citizen and their own elected representative. You see it in algorithmic gatekeepers in tech that decide what information you are allowed to see.
The moment you convince a society that the door is locked and you are the only one holding the key, you possess immense structural leverage.
And that leverage is immediately monetized, isn't it?
Instantly. You cannot get your request to the king without bribing the court gatekeeper. You cannot secure spiritual absolution without tithing the priest. You cannot navigate the legal system without paying exorbitant fees to the intermediary class.
These toll booths do not produce anything of value. They merely extract wealth, demand blind ideological obedience, and consolidate extreme power.
Entirely at the expense of the marginalized who cannot afford the toll. They create a stratified society of stepping-stone bureaucrats.
Okay, so if the toll booth is the mechanism of oppression, how does Parwez categorize the people who build and defend these booths? Like, how does he define the ultimate societal crime within this framework?
This is a really crucial point.
Because usually, religious texts frame the ultimate crime as a failure to believe the right specific dogmas.
Right. But Parwez takes the concept of shirk, a term almost universally translated in Orthodox religious contexts as polytheism, or the theological error of worshiping multiple deities, and he completely re-engineers it.
Re-engineers it how?
As a sociological catastrophe. He strips away the mystical baggage and defines shirk structurally. It is the act of giving human-made laws, temporary legislative policies, or the personal decrees of human intermediaries the exact same immutable status as the objective, divine constitution.
Wait, let me make sure I am fully grasping the weight of that. He is saying that polytheism isn't just a guy bowing to a statue.
Oh.
Polytheism, or shirk, is when a society takes the swinging door of human legislation, a tax code, a scholarly fatwa from the 12th century, a political ideology, and falsely elevates it to the status of a fixed hinge.
Precisely. When you take a temporary human policy, formulated by flawed people in a specific historical context, and you declare, this is immutable, this is divine, this can never be questioned or altered by future generations, you have committed shirk.
Why is that the ultimate crime, though? I mean, why is freezing a human law worse than, say, outright theft or physical violence?
Because it physically fractures the human community.
Like
When a society is governed by one objective constitution, the true fixed hinges everyone is equal under that single canopy of law. The law applies to the CEO identically to how it applies to the janitor.
Right.
But the moment you start elevating human intermediaries and their subjective opinions to the status of absolute law, society violently splinters.
Oh, I see.
One group pledges absolute allegiance to the scholar's unchangeable rules. Another group submits entirely to that political leader's unquestionable manifesto. You no longer have a unified humanity under one objective standard.
You have competing hostile factions. You create distinct legal jurisdictions based on human idolatry.
Yes.
And each of those factions developed its own vested interests, its own hierarchy of power, and its own toll booths that need to be fed.
Exactly. This is why Parwez argues that violent sectarianism, extreme class division, and systemic oppression are the direct, inevitable structural results of shirk.
It's not merely an incorrect theological thought floating in your head.
No, it is the physical act of tearing apart the unity of the human community by submitting to multiple competing human authorities instead of one unifying objective law.
It is the death of a rationally governed society, because human authorities will always eventually use their elevated status to exploit their followers and war against their competitors.
Spot on.
So if Parwez is systematically tearing down every toll booth, rejecting the arbitrary rule of kings, dismantling the authority of unaccountable clerics, and defining the idolization of human policy as the ultimate crime, what is left?
That's the challenge.
What does the rational alternative actually look like on the ground? It is easy to critique the system. It is incredibly difficult to build a functional alternative.
Well, the positive model Parwez extracts from these verses is absolute, unwavering obedience to the book, which he defines as the objective written constitution. And he highlights a point here regarding the prophet himself that has stunning, radical implications for the concept of equality. Parwez notes that even the prophet, the individual responsible for delivering the subjective law to humanity, is structurally bound by it.
Which fundamentally breaks the historical mold of leadership.
It shatters it.
In almost every traditional power structure, the lawgiver sits above the law. The absolute monarch drafts the penal code but possesses sovereign immunity from it. The dictator imposes austerity measures on the public while hoarding state wealth.
Right. But Parwez is saying that the architecture of this society absolutely forbids that kind of exemption.
Yeah.
He focuses on the specific term used for the prophet in this structural context, which is amin.
Amin, which translates to what?
A trusted custodian or a faithful messenger. Think about the legal parameters of a courier. A messenger does not own the contents of the message they are carrying.
Sure.
They have zero structural authority to alter the text, to redact parts they disagree with, or to append their own personal opinions into the margin. Most crucially, the messenger is completely subject to the dictates of that message themselves. If the objective law mandates a strict standard of economic justice, the individual delivering that law must face the exact same penalties for violating it as the most vulnerable member of society.
It is the ultimate test of objective law. A mail carrier delivering a court summons is just as legally bound by the laws of the road as the person receiving the summons.
Exactly. Nobody gets a free pass.
The objective constitution bows to absolutely no one. And from this premise of universal accountability, Parwez extracts specific, brutal, socio-economic laws from the text to form the foundation of this new society.
He does.
The first massive pillar he identifies is the principle of absolute personal responsibility.
Yes. The phrase utilized in the Quranic text here is, "No bearer of burdens shall bear another's burden."
In traditional readings, this is often interpreted as a comforting statement about individual spiritual accountability in the afterlife, isn't it?
It is. Parwez, however, pulls it entirely into the present physical reality. He argues that this verse structurally outlaws the very foundations of corrupt human societies: nepotism, feudalism, inherited guilt, and inherited unearned privilege.
Let's apply that to modern systems because the implications are devastating to how we currently operate.
They really are.
No bearer of burdens shall bear another's burden means you cannot legally or structurally transfer the consequences of your failures onto someone else.
Exactly.
In a feudal system, the lord makes a disastrous agricultural decision, but the peasants are the ones who starve. That is transferring the burden.
And look at modern corporate architecture.
Oh, yeah. We have systems like limited liability or too big to fail bank bailouts. A CEO makes incredibly reckless, highly leveraged bets on the market, loses billions, but walks away with a golden parachute while 10,000 frontline workers lose their mortgages and their pensions.
Parwez is arguing that under an objective constitution, that transfer of liability is a severe crime. You cannot push your debts, your risks, or your punishments onto the marginalized.
It severs the chain of exploitation from both directions, really.
Yes, because not only can you not push your burdens downward, but you also cannot inherit the unearned privileges or the stolen wealth of your ancestors.
Wow.
You enter the societal ledger with a clean slate. Your status, your wealth, and your legal standing are judged entirely on your own merit, your own actions, and your own labor, independent of your bloodline or your class connections.
Which perfectly sets up the second economic foundation he extracts, which he calls the labor principle.
Yes, the text explicitly states, man gets only what he strives for.
This isn't just a motivational poster you hang in a break room. This is a severe structural economic law. It dictates that you cannot extract wealth off the unearned labor of others.
It is a direct assault on the mechanisms of passive exploitation. If you're extracting massive wealth purely because you hold a title, or because you inherited land, or because you control a toll booth without actually contributing physical or intellectual striving, you are violating the fundamental economic law of the Constitution.
Wealth must be inextricably tied to actual effort and societal contribution, not just the possession of leverage.
Right.
How does that apply to systems like extreme stock market speculation, or someone hoarding 50 residential properties and extracting passive rent from people who actually work for a living?
This is a huge problem.
Because if man gets only what he strives for, the entire concept of generating exponential wealth simply by possessing capital without contributing labor seems entirely illegal under Parwez's reading.
Parwez would argue exactly that. A society that allows individuals to accumulate vast fortunes purely through the manipulation of capital or the hoarding of essential resources, while the people performing the actual labor remain in poverty, is a society fundamentally at war with the objective law.
It is a society that has allowed the toll booths to replace the hinges.
Perfectly said.
There is a massive psychological shift required to accept this. If this system is based entirely on objective laws, brutal personal responsibility, and actual labor, it completely vaporizes the way most of humanity views religion.
It really does.
It dismantles the entire concept of religion as an appeasement mechanism.
And that is perhaps Parwez's most defining rationalist argument. Traditional corrupted models of belief often view the ultimate authority as a hypersensitive, vain being that constantly needs to be placated.
Right.
You perform elaborate rituals, you offer sacrifices, you continuously flatter this authority to get on its good side, hoping it will grant you arbitrary favors or ignore your systemic exploitation of others.
You treat the divine exactly how you would treat a corrupt human emperor.
Yes.
It's a transactional bribe, like, I will perform this physical ritual, and in exchange, you will look the other way while I underpay my employees.
Precisely. But Parwez argues that an objective absolute authority does not possess an ego that requires stroking. The laws established in the Constitution are not there to demand flattery. They exist entirely, exclusively for human benefit.
Okay, that makes sense.
He uses a profound medical analogy to illustrate this. Imagine a highly skilled doctor diagnoses you and tells you to absolutely stop eating a specific type of poison. If you listen to the doctor and avoid the poison, you haven't pleased the doctor in any emotional sense. You haven't done the doctor a favor. The doctor doesn't personally benefit from your diet.
Right.
You have simply kept yourself alive.
If I take my prescribed antibiotics, I don't owe the doctor a philosophical debt of gratitude for the universe. The doctor just stated a biological fact.
Exactly. The doctor's rule is an objective fact regarding human biology. Following the structural law of Parwez's Constitution operates on the exact same logic.
Oh, wow.
When you refuse to exploit the labor of others, when you actively dismantle the societal toll booths, when you enforce equal justice, you are not performing a mystical ritual to appease a deity. You are executing the necessary steps for societal survival.
You are avoiding the sociological poison that historically destroys civilization.
Yes, adhering to the objective law is simply about maintaining the structural health of the social body. If a society decides to swallow the poison of massive inequality, tyranny, and arbitrary human rule, the society will inevitably die of internal hemorrhage.
It is a matter of strict cause and effect, completely devoid of divine temper tantrums or supernatural favoritism.
Absolutely.
So let's bring all these incredible threads together and look at the synthesis of what Parwez is actually arguing for. What he has accomplished here is an absolute paradigm shift.
It's monumental.
He has taken a text that for centuries has been utilized primarily to provide individual spiritual comfort, or worse, weaponized, to enforce the authority of the clerical class, and he has completely decoded it.
Literally have.
He reveals it as a heavily engineered, intensely rational blueprint for a governing society. It is a system designed from the ground up to replace the arbitrary whims of dictators, the extraction of the toll operators, and the chaos of subjective human policy with an unchangeable objective law.
Right.
It is an architecture that miraculously balances the absolute permanence of the hinges with the desperate historical need for the swinging door of adaptability.
And Parwez does not leave the outcome of this system ambiguous. He points out that the natural, inevitable result of applying this objective law when a society actually aligns itself with the cosmic blueprint is the cutting of the roots of the oppressors.
Not trimming the leaves,
Wow.
not pruning the branches of inequality so the tree looks slightly more palatable.
Cutting the roots. It is a violent structural image. It implies destroying the underlying economic and legal architecture that allows oppression to germinate in the first place.
True justice is never going to be achieved by sitting around hoping that a benevolent billionaire or an enlightened dictator happens to take the throne.
Because the structural reality is that the next dictator might be a ruthless tyrant.
Exactly. True justice is only achieved by establishing a structural, legal framework where the entity holding the most power is ruthlessly bound by the exact same consequences as the person holding no power.
Right. It is a society where the absolute power of Al-Aziz is finally, permanently tethered to the absolute reason of Al-Hakim.
It is the ultimate realization that a safe, Flourishing, intellectually honest society simply cannot exist as long as someone, somewhere, is operating above the law.
It's impossible.
The cosmic rules of gravity and physics apply to the most massive star in a galaxy exactly as they apply to a single grain of sand. The social rules of the Constitution must apply to the absolute ruler, the tech monopoly, and the highest cleric, exactly as they apply to the most marginalized citizen.
Anything less is a structural failure.
We look around at our geopolitical landscape today, and human history genuinely looks like a massive, terrifying pendulum swing. We swing wildly between two forms of societal suicide.
We do.
We swing into stifling tradition where we lock the door, enforce permanence without change, and the society suffocates from lack of innovation. Then, in response, we swing into chaotic revolution where we rip the door off the hinges, demand change without any permanent boundaries, and everything burns to the ground.
It's a devastating cycle.
If that oscillation is our historical reality, is it possible that the ultimate solution to our modern political gridlock, our massive economic inequality, and our institutional failures is hiding in this 1,400-year-old concept of the door?
It's an incredible thought.
A system that fiercely, unapologetically refuses to compromise its moral and structural hinges, yet is entirely unafraid to swing wide open to the future. I challenge you to look at your own workplace, your own community, and your own national government. What are the hinges your society is currently relying on?
Are they truly objective?
Are they genuinely protecting the marginalized, or were they installed by the people who own the building? And most importantly, when the pendulum swings back again, are those hinges built to last?